Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Accessibility Talks. We're glad you can join us for our monthly virtual meetup on accessibility, inclusion, and usability. It's a space where we learn from guest speakers and connect as a community. I'm your host, Aubrey Sambor, and I'm a lead front-end developer. For a visual description, I am a white woman with long purple and blue hair, and I am wearing a yellow hand-knit sweater. My pronouns are she, her. Before we get started, a quick reminder that A11yTalks is dedicated to maintaining a safe and welcoming environment. We ask everyone joining us today, speakers and attendees alike, to follow our code of conduct in the chat and during discussions. You can find the full version on our website. Our goal is to ensure a respectful space for open dialogue and learning. We also want to take a moment to thank the partners who make A11yTalks possible. A special thank you to our bronze sponsor, Principal Financial Group. We also want to recognize our AlleyCat Club monthly members. Every contribution helps us keep this community growing, our content free, and our talks accessible to everyone. If you'd like to support A11yTalks as a sponsor, please visit our website to learn more. Your contributions go directly toward compensating speakers and improving our events. You can also double your impact through corporate matching programs like Benevity. Just search for us under A11yTalks by Midwest Open Source Alliance. Have questions for our speaker? Here's how to ask. If you're watching the live premiere on YouTube, you can ask your question in the live chat. If you're not watching live, you can leave a comment on the YouTube video or continue the conversation on LinkedIn or other social media channels afterward. So today, we have Gerard K. Cohen, Digital Accessibility Advocate and Engineering Manager. He is presenting Solving for the Edges. I'm really looking forward to this one too. A fun fact about you, Gerard. You are a big thrill-seeking introvert, and your favorite TV show is The Golden Girls. Did you want to talk about one of those two things? I'm really curious about what kind of thrills you seek and things like that.
Yeah, thank you, Aubrey. So really sometimes my wife hates it when I say this, but sometimes I don't feel like I'm living unless I feel like I'm dying. So I like jumping off of things. I like swimming and diving with dangerous animals, observing them. So pretty much anything that gets my heart pumping is fun for me.
Nice. What kind of things have you jumped off of? Like, do you do bungee jumping or skydiving, things like that? Or yeah,
Skydiving, definitely. Yeah, skydiving
wow.
actually, and bungee jumping. There's really only a few places in the country that I think are like certified for like real legit bungee jumping. So I haven't tried that yet, but looking for someone to do that with. So if anyone wants to try it out with it, let me know.
Yeah, cool. And Golden Girls. So did you watch it when you were growing up, or like what about the Golden Girls you really like?
Yeah, it's just, it just reminds me of my childhood. Saturday nights it would come on, and just now it's just good TV to just sit and relax to after I've been jumping off of things. You kind of just calm down. Watching the Golden Girls, they're hilarious.
Yeah, they're pretty great, and that is a good way to relax after getting your adrenaline going. So yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Aubrey, and welcome everyone to Solve for the Edges. I know you could have been anywhere during doing anything else right now, so I'm grateful that you're here. This is going to be a little different for me. This won't be a really technical talk that much, which means hopefully everyone has something to learn. For those of you who I've not had the pleasure of meeting personally, let me introduce myself. My name is Gerard K. Cohen, and actually I'm currently unemployed. So if you have a need, feel free to reach out. But up until recently, I helped drive accessibility for the Atlassian design system, where I got to collaborate with a group of exceptional designers and engineers to help enhance the accessibility of components that we use to build team productivity tools, some of which you may complain about often, like Jira, Confluence, and Trello. Before that, I was the engineering manager for the Twitter accessibility team before the current owner laid us all off. So I'm going to spell my name because that's how you can find me everywhere. It's GerardKCohen. And you can reach me via LinkedIn if you search for me by name. And you could also check out my website, gerardkcohen.com. Lastly, I do have some technical courses on the Pluralsight learning platform that I'm very proud of because they are for everyone. Whether you're a PM, a visual designer, a content designer, engineer, or a QA tester, these courses are for you. And they've been used by large organizations like the state of California and the Google Africa Developer Scholarship for developers starting their coding journey. And there are a total of 4 courses, starting with the Foundations of Accessible Web Design. And this course will help you attain the knowledge and skills to meet web accessibility guidelines. Now, uniquely about this course is I go all the way through WCAG AAA, if you know what that means, since I feel like we're always telling people that WCAG AA is the bare minimum, but we don't usually tell people where to go after that. So, you know, AAA is not for everything and for everyone, but I make the case that if you're focused on good usability for all people, then AAA is not that far of a stretch. So you actually might already be doing a lot of those things. And it's a little over 2 hours, so it's a good overview and it's great for beginners. Now, once you have a good understanding of WCAG, you can move on to testing techniques for web accessibility. And this is a 2-hour course that will teach designers, content writers, developers, and QA testers quick and easy ways to test for accessibility, all without needing to use assistive technologies like screen readers, because there is so much that you can test without ever reaching for a screen reader, which, you know, can be hard to learn and use properly. If and when you are ready, I also have a course on screen reader compatibility testing for web accessibility, which is an advanced testing course. Now, as a non-native user of assistive technologies like screen readers, I try to do my best to share how to test in a way that's closer to how people actually use screen readers versus just testing with a screen reader, which, you know, is actually different. So I go through VoiceOver, JAWS, and NVDA, and even testing with iOS and TalkBack on Android, including using a keyboard with iPhones and Android phones. So all in about 2 hours. And I've not seen any other testing course go that deep. So I'm really, really proud of this one. And finally, last one is ARIA Foundations for Web Accessibility, which exposes the core foundations and concepts that will allow you to confidently build accessible custom components with ARIA using practical examples that'll help you provide inclusive experiences for all people. And I go over the ARIA spec, the dangers of ARIA, the caveats of using resources like the Authoring Practices Guide. And finally, I'll walk through an example to create a simple menu button, including how the experience differs across browser and assistive technology combinations and what to do about those differences. And this course is actually the shortest of them all at about 1.5 hours. So in a little under 8 hours, you can get a pretty well-rounded learning of accessibility based on my hard-earned experience from over 10 years of learning and making mistakes so that you don't have to. And you could find them at pluralsight.com/authors /Gerard-Cohen. And since I'm currently unemployed, these courses are my only sources of income right now. So thank you so much for being patient and indulging me as I plug these. Now, in case you want to follow along on your own, on the screen, I have a QR code that will lead you to the slides. And I also have a shortened URL. It is bit.ly, that's bit.ly /4, 7, uppercase N as in Nancy, uppercase H as in Harry, lowercase x as in X-ray, uppercase P as in Paul, uppercase Y as in yellow, and I'll keep this on the screen for a little bit here. So I want to start off with some examples of some paradigm shifting innovations over time. And these are innovations that solved almost exclusively for the edges, but also ended up making things better for everyone in between. Starting with, in 1801, an Italian inventor named Pellegrino Turri is credited for making the earliest version of a typewriter. And this was actually called the writing machine. And there are other inventors of typing machines, but this was significant because he also created the carbon paper that was used as ink for the machine. Now, the story behind this is actually kind of funny in my opinion, but back in those days when a blind person wanted to write a letter, they needed to dictate their words to someone else to write down. Now, apparently, Mr. Turri, the inventor, had fallen in love with a beautiful countess who was losing her vision. And so he created this typewriter so that she could write him some saucy letters in private without having to dictate them to anyone out loud. And on the screen now, I have a black and white photo of an old school typewriter by Underwood. There are no actual images of Turri's writing machine, but there are letters from the countess written using the typing machine. And eventually, typewriters gave way to keyboards, and we still use them today. You're probably sitting in front of one right now. Now, on the screen, I have a black and white photo of another Italian inventor, Antonio Meucci, who in 1856 invents a device called the teletrafono, which is a communication device that he used to communicate with his wife, who was bedridden with severe rheumatoid arthritis. And this was a very early version of the telephone. There's a lot of controversy around who actually invented the telephone, because in 1876, almost 20 years after Meucci, Alexander Graham Bell is first awarded the patent for the telephone. Now, with a lot of others claiming they invented the telephone before Bell, some even claiming that Bell had stolen their idea, but Bell was awarded the patent, and so we consider him the inventor. However, the drama kicked up again in 2002 when Congress passed a resolution that acknowledges Antonio Meucci as the inventor. Now, the original reason for the drama, Meucci did not have the $10 to find and complete the patent, and something about that story really resonated with me. So on the screen now is a black and white photo of Bell sitting in front of one of his devices. And just for kicks and giggles, I have an early recording of him recorded shortly after his first phone call on a really early version of a record player. So we can imagine what that first phone call would have sounded like. Now, Bell's inspiration for the telephone came from wanting to amplify sound because his mother and his wife were both deaf. Obviously, we still use phones today. In 1877, following the work of Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Edison is credited with inventing the phonograph. Now, on the screen, I have a black and white photo of Thomas Edison sitting in front of the first phonograph, which is actually turned by hand. And I also have a very early recording of Edison and his phonograph. So let's take a listen. All right, sounds like he was having a good time there. Now, one of Edison's intended uses for the phonograph was to create audiobooks for the blind. Blind people no longer needed to depend on family and friends to read to them. They could just listen to recordings on the phonograph. So basically, audiobooks. Now, this one is interesting. On the screen right now, I have an old photo of Dr. Edmond Fournier de Albe, which he was an Irish physicist, astrophysicist, and a chemist. And here he is in front of a device he invented in 1913, the optophone, which could scan pages and detect the contrast ratio between light and dark to distinguish different characters. And then it would produce audible tones that someone would recognize as the scanned characters. And I have an audio reproduction of what these audible tones sound like, but beware, they are kind of uncomfortable sounds. Now, I'm not sure if any of you could translate those sounds, but those were the lowercase letters F, I, K, J, P, Q, R, and Z. Now, his intention was to allow blind people to read books on their own, but it was really, really slow, and it would basically produce one word per minute. As a result, the optophone itself as a product did not last very long, but because it was really slow, but it was the birth of optical character recognition, or OCR technologies. So this was a very important innovation at the time. In 1948, Bell Labs, which was originally started by Alexander Graham Bell, they actually invent the transistor. And on the screen now is a photo of an early version of a transistor, which is a small device that's capable of amplifying current. And this is a very important innovation because transistors eventually lead to being an active component in practically all modern electronics. Transistors are what allow us to have small electronic systems, and they're in everything that we use today. Now, interestingly, one of the main uses of the transistor was to decrease the size of hearing aids for people that were hard of hearing. Now, another important innovation, which we take advantage of today, is speech synthesis. And it has its roots, again, from Bell Labs in 1940s. But in 1975, however, a company called TSI invents the first handheld speech synthesis called the Speech Plus. This was a talking calculator for the blind, and I have some audio of what this sounds like.
8, 7, plus 6, 5 equals 1, 5, 2.00.
So today, obviously, speech synthesis is used for all kinds of voice interfaces, and if that synthesized voice sounds familiar to anyone, maybe you played the 1980 video game Berserk, which had talking robots using this speech synthesis. Now, in 1982, Cerf, who is known as one of the fathers of the internet, creates the first commercial email system while he was working for MCI, and it was called MCI Mail. Now, in this photo on the screen, he is receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George W. Bush, just one of the many accolades that he's won over the years. And I don't know if you can tell in this picture, but maybe you can see he is wearing a hearing aid because Vint Cerf is actually hard of hearing and his wife is totally deaf. And it's said that his inspiration for creating commercial email was to be able to communicate with his family members. Of course, we still communicate via email today. And that hearing aid would not have fit in his ear had Bell Labs not created the transistor. So there's a bit of a connection there. Another father of the internet, Tim Berners-Lee, invents the World Wide Web in 1989, which sits on top of the TCP/IP protocol that Vint Cerf invented earlier. Now, the World Wide Web is what we use to interact on the internet. Not too long after, in 1990, Tim Berners-Lee creates the first web server and web client, or browser. And you can actually still see that first website that he created, and it's dedicated to describing what the World Wide Web is. And as if he had not already contributed enough to the world, in 1994, Tim Berners-Lee founds the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C, which is the main international standards organization for the World Wide Web. And of course, it's the home for the Web Accessibility Initiative, which publishes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, the ARIA spec, and countless of other accessibility-related resources. Now, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, has said that the power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect. And this is probably one of the most popular quotes in accessibility, but his intention was that the web was always meant to be accessible to everyone. So if you take all the innovations that I've mentioned, typing, sound amplification, reproduction of sound, OCR, speech synthesis, and the internet, if you put all that together, you get mobile computing. And on the screen now is supposedly a depiction of the next iPhone, which is supposed to be foldable. And all the innovations throughout history that I've shared are varied in kind and impact, but I'm sure that you've noticed some similarities that bind them all together. And I'm sure you've noticed because I was very intentional about pointing them out. These innovations treated disabilities as a design challenge. And as a result, they created assistive technologies as a solution. Assistive technologies are basically a kind of hardware, device, or software that is used by disabled people to help remove barriers created by a mismatch of their abilities and the environment around them. And these barriers can happen due to bad design decisions that did not account for varied abilities or capacities. But more than likely, these are not always intentional decisions to be bad. But it does happen a lot because our product development process fixates on the so-called average person, especially when we're talking about traditional data-driven development. Now, that may seem controversial or contradictory to you, so I'm going to tell you a few stories. And these are some lessons from the US military. The first lesson is when average almost killed pilots. Now, on the screen is a black and white photo of a large heavy lift cargo aircraft with US Air Force stenciled on the side. And technically it's a C-124, if that means anything to anyone. But in the late 1940s, the US Air Force had a serious and unexpected problem. Its best pilots that were highly trained and experienced were crashing perfectly functional aircraft at alarming rates. At one point, 17 pilots crashed in a single day. Now, naturally, leadership blamed the pilots. Of course, it had to be pilot error, right? But the pilots pushed back because it wasn't them. Now, repeated testing showed the aircraft worked as intended. Engineers checked the planes and there were no mechanical failures. But the pilots themselves knew something else was wrong. So the question became, if it's not the human and it's not the machine, then what is it? And the cause wasn't obvious, but the answer was hiding in plain sight. It was the cockpit itself. And on the screen now is a black and white photo of an old jet cockpit with lots of analog dials and 2 sets of steering wheels, pedals, and seats for pilots sitting side by side. Now, since the 1920s, cockpits had been designed for the quote unquote average pilot. Engineers had measured hundreds of American men, averaged their body dimensions, and built everything around those numbers. things like seat height, pedal distance, and control reach. And their logic seemed airtight at the time. If you design for the average person, you should fit most people. And this assumption went unquestioned for decades. Now, in 1950, the Air Force ran a massive study in order to refine what average meant. See, in the last study, it was only a few hundred men. So the Air Force thought, let's measure more, expecting a more accurate average would solve the problem. More data, right? Everybody needs more data. Now, on the screen is a black and white photo of a young military man getting his height measured. And they tracked over 4,000 pilots for 140 different measurements each. Average was defined generously as the middle 30% for each measurement. And they used just 10 out of 140 key dimensions. But a young researcher, Gilbert S. Daniels, asked a simple question. How many pilots are actually average? 0. Not one pilot matched the average across all 10 selected dimensions. Now, even across just 3 dimensions, fewer than 5% fit. And the United States Air Force learned something very surprising. When the Air Force designed cockpits for the average pilot, they discovered that almost no one actually fit that average. So pilots didn't fail, the design did. The average person does not exist, not because people are extreme, but because people are variable in different ways. Someone might have average height, but longer arms and a shorter torso and wider shoulders. This is actually called the curse of dimensionality, and the Air Force discovered this before it even had a name. A really simple definition for the curse of dimensionality is that as you add more dimensions, the average stops representing real people. When you combine multiple traits, probability shrinks rapidly. The Air Force wasn't really asking, is this person average? They were actually asking, is this person average in height and arms and legs and torso? And it was that and condition that killed the average. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, but if not, let me make it plain and apply this to accessibility and disabilities. Disabilities are not one-dimensional. It's cognitive, physical, speech, auditory, and visual. Disability spans many dimensions, not just across people, but they can vary independently and they change over time and context. And that's before we even consider temporary or situational disabilities. For example, people can be tired or stressed. People can be multitasking, talking on their phone or eating. People can sustain injuries that take time to heal. They can be in a loud or dark environment. At any moment, people are operating at the edge of one or more dimensions. And I have to wonder, how many dimensions does it take before the idea of an average person breaks down? Because once you account for enough dimensions, the average always breaks. Solving for the average is not a meaningful target at all. If we solve for the average, we solve for no one. But if we solve for the edges, then we can solve for everyone. Now, one more lesson from the Navy. On the screen now is a black and white photo of a twin propeller fighter plane flying over the ocean. And this is a story about the important data that you don't see. During World War II, the US Navy studied returning aircraft to figure out where to add armor. They mapped the bullet holes of damaged planes. And they saw heavy damage on the wings and the fuselage. Now, on the screen now is a technical drawing of a topside view of a twin propeller plane with red dots representing bullet holes that the plane had absorbed. And the obvious conclusion at the time was, reinforce those areas. But a statistician, Abraham Wald, pointed out the flaw. They were only studying the planes that made it back. The planes that were hit in other places, like the engine or the cockpit, never returned at all. So the absence of bullet holes was actually the most important signal. That's where the armor needed to go. Basically, this flawed thinking is called survivorship bias. Survivorship bias is the mistake of focusing only on the things that succeeded while ignoring all the ones that failed. And we do this with product design and development all the time. In product design and development, survivorship bias shows up when we rely on things like analytics and or usability tests. But if someone is unable to navigate your app, or if content isn't perceivable or safe to interact with, then how can they be counted? Now, I know a lot of people like to negotiate on accessibility because they say they're just testing an experiment. And the thinking is that once they figure out that people want the feature, then they can work on accessibility. But that data will be flawed because you are leaving out entire segments of people. There's also user experience testing, or UXR, especially with prototype testing. Now, even if they're high fidelity, they don't tell the whole story either. Most prototyping tools do not generate accessible code, but taking a step back, how many disabled people are even invited to this type of testing? And I always have to ask, and sometimes not even directly, but I'll ask, did anyone use only a keyboard to test this? Was this tested at different screen sizes? And I always got the same response, which is usually just silence. Again, the research will be flawed because entire segments of people are left out. And finally, customer feedback. I've heard decision makers say things like, well, nobody's complained, so it must be working well. And this is also flawed thinking. Disabled people usually don't complain, and it's not because they don't have anything to complain about, but because they can't. So let's start with some technical reasons. Are the methods of providing customer feedback even accessible? The feedback form, does that work? Is it accessible? If it's a phone number, does that provide accessible services? Or are complaints being swallowed up by a chatbot that doesn't know how to respond to that type of feedback? And we can take this even deeper and talk about how disabled people can't complain for fear of being treated differently or even being fired. Instead, they just have to work harder and longer without saying anything. Now, related to customer feedback, there's also this big stick that we like to throw around, right? The threat of being sued. But I actually gave up on that one a long time ago when I realized that settlements usually include non-disclosure agreements. So it happens silently, and only a few people know about them. I've even worked at places that could be considered classic examples of huge public disability lawsuits, and it was still hard to make anything accessible. So when someone says, well, we're not hearing complaints, we're not measuring success, we might actually be measuring absence. And just like the planes in World War II, so many decisions are made with data from the people who successfully made it through experience. In these cases, the data only tells you the what, not the how or the why. And sometimes it doesn't even tell you who. Because when it comes to accessibility issues, they don't always show up as friction. Sometimes they prevent access entirely. Ultimately, the point I'm trying to get across with these examples is, if we only solve for the people that we can count across a complex space like the human experience, we will systematically exclude the ones we can't. So, how do you solve for such a complex space? How do you stretch your bounds in today's world where the typical data may not allow for it? How do you solve for the edges when you find yourself in that uncomfortable space of not knowing exactly where the edges begin or end? So let's find out how the Air Force handled their problem. So instead of searching for a better average, the Air Force made a radical shift. They solved for variability, and in a clever way that we all benefit from today. They introduced adjustable seats, adjustable pedals, flexible control positioning, and customizable gear. And these are things that we take for granted today, but back then, the results were pretty remarkable. Pilot performance improved and accidents dropped. The system finally matched the human. What they did was provide options. It wasn't a rigid system. They solved for individuality instead of the average. Now, as a side note, even though they solved for the physical variations in a remarkable way, the practice of exclusion lasted all the way up until 2022, just 4 years ago, when they finally officially removed height requirements for fighter pilots. And this landmark decision was prompted by another issue they needed to solve. The Air Force was just short on pilots. The long-standing height requirements were based on their data for a typical American male. That meant that they were leaving out fully qualified women and ethnicities. And to me, this is a perfect example of how having all the right tools in place is only half of the story. Exclusion is not limited to just products and hardware. It's almost always a thought process, even if it's ostensibly backed by data. In any case, the lesson here is not to start providing different versions of everything for different disability types. That's the wrong outcome here. Don't do that. Not only is it not practical, it's just the wrong thing to do. But you should start asking questions around how different people perceive, operate, and understand what you produce. And think of how you could build in variability to reach the most people. So here are some factors to ponder during product planning, design, and development. First, people use different input types. Not everyone uses a mouse exclusively or all the time. Some people use a keyboard. Maybe they're using touch, maybe voice, maybe eye tracking. Maybe they're using agents. That's a thing these days, right? Point being, you shouldn't expect everyone to use a mouse just because you do. Now, taking that a step further, do all things have to be interactive all the time? This happens very often. So accessibility people like me are always yelling, "Can I use a keyboard?" And so all things become interactive all the time. At a certain point, designers may think, there's too many interactive things here. This looks really cluttered. So they decide to hide everything behind hover with, of course, equivalent keyboard focus. Now, great, the page no longer looks visibly cluttered, but did you just litter your page with hundreds of focusable elements and tab stops? You recognize the solve for the visual clutter, but not the equivalent physical clutter. And believe me, not everything needs to be drag and drop all the time. The entirety of your application does not need to happen from the side nav. And I could just feel PMs and designers seething right now. Meanwhile, engineers listening could take a break from trying to figure out how to accomplish sub-second load times with all the code needed to provide all that functionality all the time. Sorry, that turned into a bit of a rant, but I've seen some things, y'all. So moving on. People have varying ranges of visibility for a variety of reasons. Some people prefer larger text. Some people prefer smaller text. Some people can't perceive all colors. Some fonts are harder to read than others. Some people can't visually perceive the screen at all and could really benefit from text alternatives like image and audio descriptions or transcripts. People also have varying ranges of cognition for various reasons. It doesn't always have to be a disability. Maybe you didn't sleep well because your child was up all night, but you can't take the day off because your manager asked you at the last minute to write a report for them so that they could look good in front of their managers. So could you possibly simplify design? Can you remove some steps to make it easier? On the flip side, maybe it needs more steps and interactions instead of cramming everything in one step or view. Maybe icons are not really useful because nobody knows what they mean. On the flip side, they may really help convey meaning and intent quickly. Maybe your fancy motion library makes my head hurt. On the flip side, maybe tasteful motion is needed to call attention to something like a loading state. Maybe you tried to be clever and innovative, but you actually broke from convention. Back in the day, we used to have a saying, "Don't make people think." Finally, people have varying ranges of hearing for various reasons. Are you relying on audible notifications only? Some people might not catch them. Or if you relied upon them too much, maybe you're triggering people. I know a lot of people that feel some kind of way when they hear a Slack notification. Text alternatives for audio like captions or subtitles are very useful, and AI can help accelerate the delivery of this quickly and cheaply. Ultimately, the question you need to ask is, who are you leaving out? Now, you may not know, but asking is the first step to finding out. Asking this question will give you a wider audience to solve for, but I don't want you to freak out about this. I already mentioned earlier that the solution is not to provide different versions for people. But the one thing you can do is think about customization and personalization. Now, just like the Air Force did with the cockpits, solve for variability by providing options. And it's a lot easier than you think, especially when using modern CSS media queries. Now, I know I said that this would not be a technical discussion, but I still wanted to leave you with some tangible things that you can look into today that should help make it easier to provide people the opportunity to personalize their experiences. So I'll just keep this very high level. I'll give you a quick introduction and let you do a deep dive on your own as homework. So a quick explanation of a CSS media query. It's a feature that lets you apply styles conditionally based on a person's environment, including device characteristics, preferences, or system settings. Now, you've most likely already experienced conditional styles based on device characteristics. That's basically the backbone of responsive design. But what I want to talk about are the media queries specifically for user preferences or system settings for personalization. Starting off with some cross-platform media queries. There is prefers color scheme, and this is a system-level setting that allows people to set a preference for dark mode. For people that stare at a screen all day or may have light sensitivities, being able to switch to dark mode can be a big help. It's also actually a power-saving hack, so if you care about the environment, then you probably use dark mode by default. Next is prefers reduced motion, which is to detect when there's a preference to minimize the amount of non-essential motion. And this can really harm someone with motion sensitivities or really distract people with ADHD, for example. Now, to be clear, this is reduced motion, which impacts non-essential motion. This is not the same as no motion. Some motion in animation is absolutely necessary to call attention to important items or provide a status like a loading spinner. Non-essential motion is like annoying ads that are intentionally trying to steal attention, or maybe it's that clever logo or icon that jiggles every once in a while. It doesn't have to be all or nothing though. You can keep your animations in motion, but provide a static, non-animated state behind prefers reduced motion setting. And this could apply to auto-moving carousels and auto-playing videos if you're still doing that. So both prefers color scheme and prefers reduced motion are cross-platform, available now with great support, and very easy to implement. These are basically table stakes for accessibility and personalization. Next up are media queries that are platform specific. Starting with prefers contrast, which is used to detect the preference for content to be presented with either a lower or higher contrast. Now, you probably know why people would want a higher contrast, but lower contrast is a thing too if you're sensitive to light. So requesting higher contrast ratios is available on Mac OS and iOS, but unfortunately, as of right now, there's actually no way to request lower contrast. Next is forced colors, which is used to detect whether a person has selected a specific color palette for the Windows operating system. And historically, this was called high contrast mode, and I know it scares a lot of people. But it's important to note that this is not the setting for you to present your own custom color palettes. Windows has its own, so do not design for this. It's available in the rare case that you need to make minor tweaks to things like backgrounds or borders. Last is inverted colors, which is a preference for inverted colors. And this may help someone with various types of low vision. As of May 2026, it's only supported by the Safari browser on Mac OS and iOS. So if these are platform specific, why do I share them? Well, if you know you have a majority of people using Windows, then supporting forced colors might be a good idea. If you have a majority of people using Mac OS or iOS, then supporting increased contrast ratios via prefers contrast might be a good idea. Now, depending on your capabilities and maintenance needs, it might be nice just to do them. It won't break platforms that don't support them, but it's great to have in case someone actually needs them. The trade-off is that you will need to add this to your testing to make sure nothing breaks with these preferences enabled. But for what it's worth, I think it's a good trade-off, but research these along with the need from the people you target, and then make your own decision. Last up for media queries are some experimental preferences. Prefers reduced transparency is pretty obvious, but it's used to detect a preference to reduce transparent or translucent layer effects, since it can make things harder to see. As of May 2026, it is currently only supported by Chrome and Edge browsers, so basically anything that's Blink-based. But it's also behind system settings for Windows, Mac OS, and iOS. So if you have a majority of people using Chrome, and you're making heavy use of transparent or translucent layers, then this one's for you. One last thing that I do want to say is that is table stakes for supporting personalization is scaling fonts based on text size preferences. Now, there's technically no media query for this. It's just passed through most browser appearance settings. But to support this, you can use named font sizes like extra, extra small, all the way up to extra, extra large, or relative units like M, rem, or percents. So those were personalizations that were behind system settings. Now, you can take things further by providing your own personalization for settings for things like keyboard shortcuts. Give people the ability to toggle keyboard shortcuts on or off based on their need. Designers love dropping keyboard shortcuts on tooltips to expose those shortcuts on everything because that's what their design software or Figma does. For designers, keyboard shortcuts can provide a lot of efficiency, and that makes sense for them, but it's not needed on everything. So at least give people the option to turn them off. A preference for link underlines is one compromise that I've seen out in the wild. Again, designers hate link underlines, but they've been part of the internet since day zero. Designers complain that link underlines are ugly, and it bothers their highly acute sense of style, which is that's what they're made for, right? Designers, that's what they're made for. You're a designer, so if you think it's ugly, then make it look nice. You can do that now. But if you don't want to do that, or if there are too many underlines in an interface, just give people the option to turn them off if they don't need them. And notice I said turn them off. They should be on by default. You give people the ability to opt out. Another preference is density, or customizing the amount of blank space between elements. Some people prefer more items on a screen with less space between elements. There are particular industries like maybe banking or investing where data-heavy screens are needed. Think long lists and tables. Some people may prefer a more spaced out layout. Could also be good to space out touch targets too. So providing the ability to switch between high, default, and low density is a good one. Now, GitHub has an interesting setting which allows you to turn off the use of hover cards, which is basically a link preview that appears on hover of a link. And I think this is fascinating because we're getting a bit hover and pop-up obsessed. Moving your mouse from one side of the screen to the other is like walking across a floor full of Legos, right? Just everything popping up. It's kind of frustrating. And that's just a person using a mouse. You can only imagine the experience for people using various assistive technologies with all the extra content. So I like this option, and I wish more people did it. That being said, I understand that providing preferences requires a lot, but honestly, I think it's the cost of doing business if you're going to start providing this ultra dynamic and complex experiences. There are also some personalizations that I want to advise against. Personalizations are great, but they need to be grounded in practicality and utility. For example, themes for color blindness. Now, you may think this is a good idea, but color blindness operates in a range of spectrum of colors. Why do you think you could pick the exact color values to help here? Why are you relying on color that much anyways? Trust me, this is a vanity project, and if you're working on this specialized of an accessibility preference, you better have everything else buttoned up and in place already, because this one is not the business. Screen reader mode is another one. Again, what are you doing that is not already supported by assistive technologies like screen readers? And what do you think you can do to make that better with the screen reader mode? Do you even know how much work this is? If you just follow standards, let people use assistive technologies set their own preferences with their assistive technology. I would highly recommend against going down this path. And I can hear some of you say, but my code editor does this. Well, if your code, never mind. You get it. And please, please, please do not put basic accessibility requirements behind settings or preferences. If you think minimum contrast ratios are hard or ugly, don't put minimum contrast behind a setting. Again, links should be underlined by default. If you don't like them, then you can turn it off for yourself. And like I just mentioned, don't put screen reader or assistive technology support behind a setting. Not only does that take so much work, in most cases, it doesn't even work at all. So I recommend you optimize the basics, things like color contrast, touch targets and density, font size, things like this, and then you provide additional options for personalization. That's how you do it right. So let me give you a few minutes. Actually, let me spend a few minutes to give you some examples of basics that you should be optimizing by default. The first is pretty easy to consider, and that's color. Choose colors wisely because not all humans can see colors the same way. One example, the reason why Meta is branded with blue is because Mark Zuckerberg has deuteranopia. I always have a hard time saying that. Basically, it's a red-green color blindness. So the color he sees best is blue, and that's why Meta is blue. Another consideration is contrast of colors. Be careful of the foreground and background colors. You should be able to clearly see the differences between these colors, regardless of an inability to see different colors. Lastly, be aware of using color alone to signify meaning. We often use red to mean something is bad or green then something is good. But if you're like Mark Zuckerberg and you're unable to recognize red or green, then what happens when you use only those colors to signify something? Well, technically, if you're him, you just turn yourself into AI. Anyways, the meaning of those colors is lost. But to be clear, this is not saying you can't use colors. The guidance is not to use colors only. Use plain text or icons in addition to colors in a good way to augment colors to provide meaning. The next consideration is language. Basically, use simple language. There are different reading and comprehension levels. Not everyone speaks English as a primary language. Using simple language helps everyone. Be prepared to internationalize. Now, the internet made the world a smaller place, and someone from a different part of the world that doesn't speak English may want to use your application, site, or service. You don't necessarily need to translate into every language out of the gate, but you should have the system in place to be able to support different languages when you are ready. Lastly, it's not necessary to require gender, age, or prefix anymore for most sign-up forms. If those things are absolutely necessary, then make sure you provide a way for users to change those values, as these things can change over time. Touch interfaces have simplified interactions for users. If your innovation involves touch, make sure you have large touch target sizes. They should look like they're interactive and be large enough to activate. You should also try to avoid complex gestures. You shouldn't have to move your hands like a magician revealing a trick as an important gesture. Also, don't require actions to be completed within a certain amount of time, or require gestures to be completed within a specific time sequence or a tempo. Above all, be sure to provide alternate interactions. Gestures should not be the only way to accomplish something. Sometimes a single tap or swipe should be enough. Voice interfaces have been a big help to a lot of people, but you have to be mindful of different speech patterns and accents. My mother, for example, can't use Siri because it doesn't recognize her heavy Mexican accent. Now, these things are getting better, but we still have a lot to do to recognize things like stutters or stammers. 7.5 million people have trouble using their voice, and at least 3 million people stutter. So be sure to use short and easy to remember utterances. Long commands to memorize and say, they just don't help. Instead of being required to say, set timer to 15 minutes, you should be able to accept timer 15 minutes. And of course, as mentioned earlier, make sure to provide alternate interactions. Voice should not be the only way to accomplish something. The easiest way, alternate, is to accept typed commands. Now, facial recognition is not really new, but it is becoming more mainstream. It's been around since 1965, and surprisingly, we still have the same problems today as back then. As with voice interactions, be aware of varying situations. Lighting will change the way people look. A beard may change the way someone looks. Different angles change faces completely. Different people look different. There are different skin tones and shapes. We've all heard of these horrible stories, for example, automatic paper towel dispensers only recognizing light-colored hands, or eye scanning technology not able to recognize Asians. It's happened, and this is absolutely horrible. It excludes people by the very traits that make them human. So be sure not to build in any bias into your technology, and again, always provide an alternate interaction. Facial recognition should not be the only way to accomplish a task. We found out real quick that masks during COVID really impacted facial recognition. So it's a good thing you were able to unlock your phone in other ways instead of only Face ID. That's a real use case of providing alternate interactions. And my last consideration, the best way to avoid those horrible situations based on personal biases or unknowns is to hire right. Diversity is extremely important. If you're sitting in a room and everyone looks like you or comes from the same place, then something is wrong there. A lot of times, we hire based on a specific company culture. We want to hire people that fit that existing culture, but we shouldn't be trying to fit the culture. We should be trying to expand it and add to the company culture by hiring different people. Quite simply, there's no presentation without representation. And if you're making things for people, you should have all people represented and included in the process. We don't want to just do things for humans. We want to do things with humans. Ultimately, working with real humans is always going to help you expand the sphere of awareness and help you get closer to the edges. Because the goal isn't to hit the middle, it's to handle the edges, because the edges are where real people live. And that's it. Thank you.
That was excellent. This was such a great talk. So thank you so much for giving this. Yeah, there's so many good things I took away from this. Yeah, it was just really, really, really great. So thank you so much for this talk.
Oh, my pleasure.
I
I'm glad
really
you liked
liked
it.
the point. I didn't realize that the height requirement for fire pilots didn't get removed until 2022. That was something I definitely learned from this. That is,
Yep.
yeah, I got some words about that.
Right.
Yep. But oh, that was so good. So yeah, I have a couple questions for you. So yeah, I'll get started with those. First and foremost, how did you get into web accessibility? Where did you get started in your accessibility journey?
Wow. So I'll try to tell the fast version of this story. So, you know, I've done a lot of different things with technology since I was a teen, from hardware to software, networking, all kinds of things. But I really kind of gravitated towards front end development because it was just so much funner to me just to sharing that experience with people. And I came up during the time of Jeffrey Zeldman and working on standard based development. And so in my small brain, I thought, okay, yeah, I'm doing accessibility. Like, this is great. And I started a new job one time, and the second day I went up to go meet someone in the design team that was focused on accessibility. Actually, a great person. His name's Kevin Kalahiki, and he's really nice. He just asked me. He said, "Oh, do you know accessibility?" I was like, "Yes, standard semantics, blah blah." And then he asked me, "Do you know ARIA?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I told him that. And he said, and if you know Kevin, he's just very gracious. He's like, "That's okay, you'll learn." And I did. So I took that as a challenge and became the accessibility person on my team. And one day we went down. So another area of this place put on a global accessibility awareness day event, and they had a bunch of exhibits. And so I took my team down. I was like, "Hey, let's go check this out." And we actually saw some of the software that we were working on. We saw videos of people using it and some of the troubles they were, having. And I realized at that moment that I myself personally have a huge impact on the way people work and live every day. And from that moment on, it really just became a passion of mine, just to make sure that people are able to work, live independently, and be able to provide for themselves. So that's really what started it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think you and I came up around the same time. I'm a front end developer, so Jeffrey Zeldman was definitely a huge influence on me, and Eric
Yep.
Meyer too. I
Yep.
really loved both of them when I was getting into this over 20 years ago now.
Yep.
So
That's about right.
yeah, yep. And that's when I got into accessibility at first, was maybe early 2004 or so. So yeah, that's really cool. So yeah, I'm glad you got into it, and I'm glad you were able to see users use the product you were working on. So I think that's also really useful, especially since you said that earlier in your talk too. Speaking of
Right.
your talk, where did you get the idea for this talk?
Well, part of it's personal. I'm just kind of, there's enough information around, just semantics and, you know, technology and the technical implementation of accessibility. But I've been moving towards as I get a little bit older, I start to realize that it's so much more than that, and that as humans, there's so many different ways that we interact with the world, that it's not just bits and bytes. And I wanted to expand my own awareness around that. So that's why, probably about 10 years ago, I started working with a design team, not as a designer, because I have no sense of creativity, but started to learn the design side of accessibility, and got into, things like, user research, ethnography, those kinds of things. So really just trying to expand myself, but then everyone else to try to continue moving a little bit left, right? We say shift left all the time. So just trying to help people to think about the things that we've been doing for so long and just think of them differently, because the world's changing. Everything's changing around us. This is the human experience, and that changes over time, on top of browsers changing, assistive technologies changing. Even the interfaces that we're doing now, very complex, and we're moving into maybe even no interface with AI. So I'm just trying to, just expand that sphere of awareness.
Yeah, that's great. Where would you get started if you're looking more into the design side of accessibility? Because yeah, again, as a developer, if I wanted to learn more about accessible design, are there any resources that you would recommend? Would you recommend finding designers to talk to them about their about what they would do with accessibility, or do you have another suggestion?
Um, I think social media is still the best place because there's a lot of information on the internet over the last 25, 30 years, however long the internet's been around, that is good, but maybe not so good. I think finding people that are actually doing the work is really important. So I can't think of any off the top of my head because I now at my stage, I kind of just stay off of social media. So these are mostly personal relationships that I have with designers.
Mm-hmm.
But I would recommend for someone starting out, really just reach out to and follow designers that are known for working in accessibility. And there's a difference, right? We have engineers and designers that do things accessibly, and then we have accessibility people that design and engineer. And I would say focus on the accessibility people that design and engineer because they're the ones that are really solving the problems that we need to solve, and they help the rest of us that are just the engineers working in accessibility, the designers working in accessibility. So long story short, try to reach out to actual humans on social media, and if you can, join any local accessibility meetups and meet people. Go to conferences. There's a lot that are online that are free, but there's also in-person ones. And the best thing about the in-person ones is that's where you actually get to meet people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
And you get that experience of being able to talk to them and see how they operate and navigate. And that really opens up a lot, I think. So just like I said in the talk, just actually talk to and meet and work with people with disabilities.
Yeah, that's great. I have one more question for you. What is the top thing you want people to take away from this talk? Like, what should they know after watching this talk?
Oh, well, specifically, like I said, there's two things to that. The basic one is the cliche of you're not your user, right? But relating that back to the premise of this presentation was, we often use data to prove or disprove things, and we have to understand that a lot of times that data is flawed or it's highlighting only a specific area. And when you start to do that, you're leaving out so many other good learnings that you can have that will actually improve what it is you're trying to get across. So yeah, just keep asking questions. Who are we leaving out? Maybe you have the data, but you have to dig into that data and start asking who, what, and where and why. I think is the most important thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think just talking to people in general, I think that is the first and foremost thing to take away is talk to actual humans, talk about their experiences. Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice.
Yeah, and as an introvert, I would just say as an introvert, that's really hard for me to do.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's where I've learned the most from, so I'm thankful for it. Yeah, definitely got to step outside of yourself and actually talk to and meet some people.
Yeah, it's always hard, but it's definitely where you learn the best things. So
Right.
yeah, I think that's really good. Thank you, Gerard. Let's continue the conversation on our LinkedIn event. You can find us at linkedin.com/company/A11yTalks. We're always looking for new voices, especially from marginalized groups in tech. Visit our speakers page to learn more, then reach out on LinkedIn or email us at team@A11yTalks.com to start the conversation. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a talk, and follow us on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Mastodon to stay in the loop. You can find all these links and more on our website. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. See you next time.